It was April 1483. England was enjoying a time of peace. King Edward IV was on the throne. He was a popular king. He was handsome, charming, and a strong leader. He had brought an end to the long and bloody Wars of the Roses. But then, disaster struck. The king, still in his early 40s, suddenly fell ill. No one expected it. He had seemed so full of life and energy just days before. The doctors could do nothing for him. On the 9th of April, King Edward IV died, leaving his kingdom in shock. The future of England, once so secure, was now very uncertain. The new king was Edward's eldest son. He was also named Edward. But there was a problem. The new King Edward V was only 12 years old. He was too young to rule the country by himself. A young king needs guidance. He needs protection from those who might want to take his power. The court was a dangerous place, full of ambitious nobles. Everyone knew that the years until the young king came of age would be difficult. A council would have to rule in his name. The question on everyone's lips was, who would lead that council? Who would hold the real power in England? At the time of his father's death, young Edward was not in London. He was at Ludlow Castle on the border with Wales. It was his own small court where he was learning how to be a ruler. His mother's family, the Woodvilles, were with him. The Woodvilles had become very powerful during Edward IV's reign. They were ambitious and not always popular with the older noble families. Now, with the king dead, they saw a chance to increase their influence even more. They wanted to control the young king and, through him, the entire country. But they were not the only ones with plans. Far away in the north of England was the king's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was a loyal and trusted commander. He had served his brother Edward IV faithfully for years. He was known for being serious, religious, and a good soldier. Edward IV had trusted him completely. In his will, the late king had named Richard as the Lord Protector of the realm. It was Richard's job to protect his young nephew, Edward V. He was meant to govern England until the boy was old enough to rule alone. But Richard had his own ideas about what was best for the kingdom. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, heard the news of his brother's death while he was in the north. He must have been deeply saddened. He had always been loyal to Edward. But he was also a practical man. He knew that the situation was dangerous. A boy king meant that powerful people would fight for control. Richard believed that the Woodville family, the Queen's relatives, were a threat. He thought they were greedy and would misuse their power. He felt it was his duty as Lord Protector to stop them. His first task was to secure the person of the new king, his nephew. The will of Edward IV was clear. Richard was to be the Lord Protector. This gave him immense authority. He was essentially the ruler of England until Edward V came of age. The King's Council in London knew this, but the Woodvilles wanted to limit his power. Queen Elizabeth Woodville and her family wanted to crown the young king as quickly as possible. Once Edward V was officially crowned, there would be no need for a Lord Protector. The Woodvilles could then rule through a council that they controlled. It was a race against time. Who would get to the young king first? Richard began to ride south from his base in Yorkshire. He was not alone. He had a small army of loyal followers with him. He also sent letters to other important nobles. He needed allies. One of his most important supporters was the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was another powerful nobleman who disliked the Woodvilles. Together, Richard and Buckingham made a plan. They would intercept the young king on his journey from Ludlow to London. They presented this as their duty. They were protecting the king from his ambitious relatives. But was it really about protection, or was it about taking control? The Woodvilles were not sitting idle. The Queen's brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, was with the young king. He was a respected scholar and knight. He was escorting his nephew to the capital for his coronation. They had their own soldiers with them. They traveled slowly, not expecting any trouble. They believed that Richard would respect the late king's wishes and his family. They were wrong. At a town called Stony Stratford, Richard and Buckingham made their move. They arrived suddenly, surprising the king's party. The power struggle had begun, and it was not going to be peaceful. The meeting at Stony Stratford was tense. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and the Duke of Buckingham confronted Earl Rivers, the king's uncle. Richard accused Rivers and his allies of plotting against him. He claimed they were trying to sideline him and seize power for themselves. Rivers was shocked. He insisted he was only doing his duty, bringing the king to London for his coronation. But Richard was not listening. He was the Lord Protector, and he was taking charge. He ordered the arrest of Earl Rivers. He also arrested the king's half-brother, Richard Grey, and other members of the Woodville party. Imagine being the young King Edward V. You are 12 years old. Your father has just died. You are on your way to London to become king. Then your uncle Richard arrives. He is a man you have been taught to trust. But he arrests your other uncle, your guardian. He tells you that your mother's family are traitors. You are now in his care. The boy king was said to have protested. He was upset and confused. But what could he do? He was a child surrounded by powerful men with swords. He had no choice but to go with his uncle Richard. News of these arrests traveled fast. It reached London before Richard did. Queen Elizabeth Woodville was terrified. She knew what this meant. Richard had taken control of her son. She feared for her own life and the lives of her other children. Without hesitation, she gathered her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters. They fled to the safety of Westminster Abbey. In those days, a church offered sanctuary. It was a sacred place where enemies could not touch you. The Queen and her children became political refugees, hiding in the heart of the capital city. The royal family was now broken and divided. Richard and Buckingham rode into London in triumph. They brought the young King Edward V with them. They presented themselves as the saviors of the kingdom. They told the people that they had rescued the king from the clutches of the wicked Woodvilles. Many people in London were happy to believe them. The Woodvilles were not popular, and Richard had a reputation for being an honest and just man. He moved the young king into the Tower of London. At the time, this was not seen as a prison. The Tower was a royal palace, a secure residence where kings often stayed before their coronation. Everything seemed to be proceeding as planned. Once King Edward V was inside the Tower of London, Richard's control was almost complete. The Tower was a fortress. It was a royal palace, but it was also a prison. It was the strongest castle in the kingdom. With the king safely inside its walls, no one could get to him without Richard's permission. Richard reassured the public and the king's council. He said he was simply preparing his nephew for his coronation. The date was even set for late June. For a while it seemed like Richard was truly acting as the loyal Lord Protector he was meant to be. He governed the country, making decisions in the young king's name. But Richard needed more than just the king. The Queen was still in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. With her was her younger son, Richard, Duke of York. He was only 9 years old. As long as the Woodvilles had a prince with them, they still had a symbol of power. Richard, the Lord Protector, argued that it was not right for the young duke to be cooped up in sanctuary. He said the two brothers should be together. They could keep each other company in the Tower as they prepared for the coronation. He presented it as a kind and thoughtful act. The Queen refused. She did not trust Richard. She was afraid of what he might do to her sons, but she was under immense pressure. Richard sent the Archbishop of Canterbury to persuade her. He surrounded Westminster Abbey with his soldiers. The message was clear. She could not stay there forever. The Queen was trapped. She had no army and no powerful friends left to help her. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, she handed over her younger son. It was a heartbreaking moment. She was saying goodbye to her child, knowing she might never see him again. The young Duke of York was taken to join his brother in the Tower of London. Now Richard had both of Edward IV's sons in his custody. The two princes were seen playing in the gardens of the Tower for a few days. The people of London could catch a glimpse of them. It seemed to confirm that they were safe and well. But then, as the days of June wore on, the sightings became less frequent. Soon they stopped altogether. The boys were no longer seen. They had vanished from public view, locked away behind the thick stone walls of the tower. A dark silence fell over their fate. As the summer of 1483 began, a strange quiet descended over the Tower of London. The two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, were no longer seen playing in the gardens. They had disappeared from sight. At first, people might have assumed they were simply busy with their studies, preparing for the coronation. But as the days turned into weeks, a feeling of unease began to spread through London. Where were the boys? Why was no one allowed to see them? The Tower, once a symbol of royal power, was now starting to feel like a place of secrets and shadows. Rumors began to circulate. They started as quiet whispers in taverns and marketplaces. People asked questions. Was the king ill? Had there been an accident? The official silence from Richard, the Lord Protector, only made things worse. It created a vacuum that was quickly filled by fear and suspicion. Many people started to suspect the worst. They remembered the long and bloody history of royal families. They knew that uncles had removed nephews from their path to the throne before. The dark whispers grew louder. People started to believe that the princes were not just hidden, but that they were in grave danger. The fate of the princes in the Tower has become one of history's greatest mysteries. We do not know for certain what happened to them. They were never seen alive again after that summer. The most common belief, both then and now, is that they were murdered, and the chief suspect was their uncle Richard, the Lord Protector. He had the motive. With the princes out of the way, he could become king himself. He had the means. He controlled the Tower and every mercy. This suspicion poisoned the air of England. Even if people did not say it out loud, they thought it. How could a man do such a thing to his own nephews? To the sons of his brother? It seemed monstrous. For Richard's supporters, it was a terrible accusation to deny. For his enemies, it was powerful propaganda. The story of the missing princes would hang over Richard's head for the rest of his life and for centuries after. It painted him as a villain, a ruthless tyrant who would stop at nothing, not even the murder of children, to get the crown. While the princes were disappearing from view, I was making my final move. I couldn't simply take the crown. I needed a legal reason. I had to convince the country that I had a better right to be king than my nephew, Edward V. So, my allies and I started a shocking new story. We claimed that my brother, the late King Edward IV, had not been legally married to Queen Elizabeth Woodville. We even found a priest who swore that Edward IV had secretly promised to marry another woman before he met Elizabeth. In those days, such a promise was just like a legal marriage contract. If this story were true, it meant that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. And if the marriage was invalid, then all of their children were illegitimate. This included the two princes in the Tower, Edward and Richard. According to the law, an illegitimate child could not inherit the throne. Suddenly, the 12-year-old King Edward V was not a king at all, just a boy with no legal claim to the crown. This clever and probably false legal argument was exactly what I needed. It was all written down in a document called the Titulus Regius, the title of the king. With my nephews declared illegitimate, the path was clear. Who was next in line to the throne? It was me. I was the true and loyal brother of Edward IV. I was the one who could bring stability and justice to the kingdom, at least that's the story I told. On the 26th of June, 1483, members of Parliament and the City of London gathered. The Duke of Buckingham gave a powerful speech, explaining the legal case against the princes, and then offered the crown to me. In a carefully staged performance, I pretended to be reluctant at first, but eventually I accepted my destiny. Just a few weeks after I had brought my nephew to London for a coronation, I was crowned myself. On the 6th of July, 1483, in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey, I, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became King Richard III. My wife, Anne Neville, was crowned as my queen. The transformation was complete. The loyal Lord Protector was gone, and in his place sat a usurper, a man who had taken the throne from his own nephew. Many people were shocked and horrified. They had watched a man seize power in less than 3 months. The question now was, would I be able to keep it? As King Richard III, I knew my hold on the throne was weak. I had many enemies. There were the Woodvilles, who hated me for what I had done to their family and to the princes. There were the old supporters of the House of Lancaster, who had always opposed the Yorkist kings. And there were even people who had once supported me, but were now horrified by my actions. I needed to show everyone that I was a strong king. I had to make it clear that I would not tolerate any opposition. So, I decided to make an example of anyone who dared to challenge me. One of the first to feel my wrath was Lord Hastings. William Hastings had been a very close friend and loyal supporter of the late King Edward IV. At first, he had supported my role as Lord Protector. He also disliked the Woodvilles. But he would never agree to disinheriting Edward IV's sons. He was loyal to the boy king, Edward V. During a council meeting in the Tower of London, I suddenly accused Hastings of treason. I claimed Hastings was plotting against me with the Woodvilles. It was a shocking and probably false accusation. I did not give Hastings a trial. There was no time for lawyers or evidence. According to the story, I was so angry that I swore I would not eat my dinner until Hastings was dead. Lord Hastings was dragged out of the council chamber and into the courtyard of the tower. He wasn't even given time to confess his sins to a priest. There, on a rough block of wood, he was beheaded. The execution was brutal and swift. It sent a shockwave through the English nobility. If a man as powerful and well-connected as Lord Hastings could be killed so easily, then no one was safe. This act of violence was a clear message. I was a king who would not hesitate to use force. Fear became a tool of my government. People who might have spoken out against me were now too scared to do so. They kept their heads down and their opinions to themselves. But this kind of rule creates resentment, not loyalty. While I was trying to secure my throne through fear, I was actually creating more enemies. The execution of Hastings convinced many nobles that I was a tyrant. They began to plot against me in secret, waiting for their chance to strike back. The fear and suspicion that my actions had created soon boiled over into open rebellion. By the autumn of 1483, less than 4 months after my coronation, a massive revolt was organized against me. The rebellion was widespread, with uprisings planned across the south of England. What was surprising was who was leading it. The main leader was not a Woodville or a Lancastrian. It was Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, the same Duke of Buckingham who had been my closest ally. He had helped me take the throne and had given the speech offering me the crown. Why did Buckingham turn against me? It is another mystery from this period. Perhaps he was genuinely horrified by the rumored murder of the princes. Maybe I had not rewarded him as generously as he had expected. Some people believe that Buckingham had his own distant claim to the throne and saw an opportunity to take it for himself. Whatever his reason, his betrayal was a huge blow. It showed that even my closest friends did not trust me. Buckingham became the figurehead for all the people who were angry and afraid of the new king. The plan was for a series of coordinated uprisings. Buckingham would raise an army in Wales and march into England. At the same time, other nobles would rise up in different counties. The ultimate goal was to overthrow me. But who would they put on the throne instead? At first, the plan might have been to rescue the princes from the Tower, but as the rumors of their deaths grew stronger, the rebels needed a new candidate. They found one across the sea in Brittany. His name was Henry Tudor. He was a distant relative of the old Lancastrian kings. The rebellion, however, was a disaster. It was plagued by bad luck and bad weather. As Buckingham tried to march his army out of Wales, terrible storms hit the country. Rivers flooded, making roads impassable. His army was soaked, miserable, and couldn't cross the River Severn to join the other rebels. The great storm was so severe that people called it Buckingham's Flood. My spies had also learned of the plot. I acted quickly and decisively. My own army marched to meet the rebels, who were disorganized and scattered. The rebellion fell apart before it even began. With his rebellion in ruins, the Duke of Buckingham became a hunted man. He disguised himself and tried to hide, but he was soon betrayed by one of his own men. He was captured and brought to me in the city of Salisbury. Buckingham begged to see me, his former friend. But I refused. There would be no mercy. Just like Lord Hastings, Buckingham was executed for treason without a proper trial. I had crushed the rebellion and eliminated its leader. I must have felt that my throne was now secure, but I was wrong. The rebellion had failed, but it had created a new and more dangerous enemy. The new hope for all of my opponents was Henry Tudor. Henry had been living in exile in France and Brittany for years. He was the great-great-grandson of King Edward III, which gave him a very weak claim to the throne through the Lancastrian line. But he was the best candidate the Lancastrians had. After Buckingham's rebellion failed, many of my enemies fled England. Disaffected Yorkists, who were angry about the fate of the princes, joined the old Lancastrians in exile. They all gathered around Henry Tudor. He promised to marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, to unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York. This was a brilliant political move. The marriage proposal meant that Henry was not just a Lancastrian claimant. He was fighting for the rights of the House of York as well. He promised to end the Wars of the Roses for good by uniting the two families. This brought him a lot of support from powerful people who were tired of the constant conflict. Henry Tudor, who had once been an obscure exile, was now the leader of a powerful coalition. He had the money and support of the King of France, who was happy to cause trouble for England. He began to gather an army and ships to invade. Back in England, I found myself increasingly isolated. I had won the battle against Buckingham, but I was losing the war for my people's hearts and minds. The stories about the murdered princes would not go away. My harsh justice had created fear, not loyalty. My wife, Anne Neville, died in early 1485, and my only son had died the year before. I was alone, surrounded by enemies and spies. I knew that Henry Tudor was coming. The final confrontation was inevitable. The fate of England would be decided not in a council chamber or by a legal document, but on the battlefield.